Tillerson later clarified and said the U.S. would still like to see Assad leave power. Jamie, he then said the U.S. hopes that Russia will help to negotiate a peace deal.
Margaret, we've seen ceasefires in Syria before. How is this one going to be different?
Well, Tillerson says it's different because he believes that the defeat of ISIS is imminent and that the U.S. military role there in Syria will likely come to an end. So he says Russia has an incentive now to make it work. But these paper agreements only count if the fighters on the ground comply. And so the test of this will be whether or not both the U.S. and Russia can get the various fighting factions to comply and to stop fighting. Remember, the other big player who wasn't in the room today is Iran, and they have a significant number of militias, and they were not in that room today. We'll have to see if they and Bashar al-Assad follow through.
Yeah, they're a specific piece of that puzzle, an important piece. Margaret, it seems the ceasefire announcement is probably the best thing to come out of this meeting for the president today. But Russian election hacking was definitely the elephant in the room. I think everybody talking about that. It looks like there's a lot of he said there. Will we ever really know what happened in more in depth about the 2-hour meeting these two had?
Well, the only other administration official in the room with Presidents Putin and Trump was the Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, along with his Russian counterpart. So it's really Rex Tillerson's account that all of us are relying upon, as well as the public on-camera remarks that the Russian foreign minister shared. The State Department is going to be hashing out more details of just what the Syria deal is going to look like. But when it comes to election meddling, Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of State, said that President Trump really pushed the issue, that this was likely an intractable one. So they're sort of agreeing to disagree and now going to move forward in the relationship. But the Russian accounts of this say that President Trump accepted Putin's denials, basically ceded the point. Wasn't going to continue disagreeing about it if he disagrees at all. Because remember, Jamie, just a few days ago, President Trump said at a press conference that he's not totally convinced it's Russia that's responsible for the hacking of the U.S. election. He said other players might also have been involved as well.
Putin wasn't the only world leader that President Trump met with on Friday. He also had that meeting with the president of Mexico. Can you talk about how that meeting went?
Well, we know that Mexico announced that negotiations to begin redrafting NAFTA, that's the free trade deal that President Trump campaigned on, calling it unfair, and has vowed to completely rewrite. They say all those talks are going to begin in August, so that's news. But what is really interesting is that the meeting happened at all, because President Peña Nieto, if you remember, called off his scheduled visit to the White House shortly after President Trump was inaugurated because he insisted publicly that Mexico pay for his proposed border wall. Today, President Trump was asked about it, and he said that's absolutely still the plan. But we've heard varying accounts over the past few months. Mexico insists they're not going to pay for it, and President Trump himself said, well, maybe he's got a new idea to turn the border wall into solar panel lined construction that would essentially help pay for itself. So we're going to have to see if the campaign rhetoric and the actual agreement actually match up here. And walking back some of that rhetoric may be why they were able to sit down at the same table today and begin talking.
Yeah, we'll have to see what happens as we move forward in this. President Trump meeting with the president of China as well. That's happening Saturday. How do you expect that to play out, especially in the wake of North Korea's latest missile launch here? There's a lot of talk about this.
There is. It's very high stakes and perhaps one of the most imminent threats in the wake of that North Korean ballistic missile test that the U.S. is still looking for ways to respond to with some degree of a show of force. Remember, we need Russian and China's help to get those international sanctions that you heard Ambassador Nikki Haley calling for just the other day. So this meeting with Xi Jinping may be focused on just that. Can China get to a place where they say, we don't want the U.S. to take severe action, so we'll give you a point or two here and maybe work with you on sanctions? That's going to be one topic tomorrow. We also know that President Trump's rhetoric recently in the public space about giving up essentially on China because they aren't delivering on these pledges to help on North Korea. we are unlikely to see any major breakthroughs on that front, because you have heard administration officials in recent days sort of walk back the warmongering rhetoric. It was Defense Secretary Mattis who really just 2 days ago hit the brakes on that, said this doesn't put us any closer to war. Diplomacy is the first step here. So you're likely to see President Trump and his Secretary of State push the Chinese to get to some round of diplomacy of some sort to try to find a negotiated solution, because anyone that they get to is going to require Beijing's help.
Yeah, diplomacy is the hope here. Margaret, before I let you go, I want to get your final thoughts about the president's second foreign trip now in office. How are other world leaders reacting to his style of diplomacy?
Well, it's not just the world leaders. Of course, you've seen with these protests in the streets of Hamburg, President Trump's effigy, his image is being associated with many of these very left-wing activists, sometimes violent protests, because he's sort of portrayed as this symbol of what they think needs to be resisted. His breaking up, as he would describe it, U.S. involvement in that climate change agreement. Those things not only riled up left-wing activists, they riled up a lot of the European powers and world powers who signed on to that deal and are still abiding by it. So President Trump, in many ways, started this second international trip with the hopes of repairing some relationships here, because right now, solving many of the problems the U.S. is facing, like North Korea, requires those countries to work with us, not against us. And so there has been a bit more of a diplomatic focus, you've heard, in President Trump's own rhetoric in that speech he gave in Poland, where he said a lot of the things he needed to say to reassure European leaders, like committing to that collective defense clause in NATO. So in some ways, this was a bit of a do-over on that front. We haven't seen the same kind of strong words that riled up some of our allies during that trip to Brussels back in May, when President Trump didn't say some of the things allies would have liked him to explicitly pledge.
Very true. Great discussion. Margaret Brennan in Hamburg, thank you so much for being with us.